2004, and we're interviewing Mr. George Goodwin, who's now 87 years old. He allowed me to say that. I've known about George all my adult life because my sister-in-law had the great privilege of working with him back in the late 50s, early 60s. And he's one of the people that I've never heard anything but bad about in my life. I know he won the Pulitzer Prize, which I hope he'll tell us about, when he got out of the service and wrote a expose on the voting fraud in Telfair County. And I know he graduated from WNL, had a public relations firm, and was one of the founders of Trinity Presbyterian Church. And with that as an introduction, George, I just want you to start talking about what it was like to grow up in the Depression and where it led you, and free associate a little if you don't mind.
Well, first, let me thank you for including me in the list of those you're talking to. But to respond directly to your question, I was born in Atlanta in 1917. My parents were divorced fairly early on, and I grew up in the home of my mother's sister and her husband. His name was Ben Burgess. He was a home builder in Atlanta. And the four of us lived together. Atlanta in the Depression was not much different from Atlanta before the so-called Depression, because when you stop to think about it, the South's Depression extended from Appomattox to Pearl Harbor, because once Appomattox was over, the South was flat broke, and Atlanta, which was one of the leading cities of the region, I guess only New Orleans was larger, was in some ways almost destitute. A couple of examples. In the First National Bank of Atlanta, with which I worked for a while, had 5 antecedents. The primary one was the Atlanta National Bank, which was founded in 1865. It was the first bank established after the Civil War. And even today, Wachovia of Georgia, which eventually acquired First National, uses that symbol 64-1 on their checks. It was 10 years before that bank, in the second largest city of the region, had $1 million on deposit. It's always the largest bank in town. It was 1917, the year that I was born, before it had $10 million. When I went to work for it in 1952, I guess it was, it had around 300 million. But you can see that through that period, there just was very little cash in the region. Another story that ties to that, one day, and I think it was 1950, I was working for the Atlanta Journal. And I usually covered City Hall. But one day the city editor called and said, the Capitol man is off today. How about going over and checking out what's going on at the Capitol? Well, I'd done that often enough to know what the routine was. At the Capitol, the reporters all went around together. And so I think there were 3 of us on that particular day. And he stopped by the governor's executive assistant's office and various others, including the state auditor, who was always up on everything. And the usual question, anything going on? And B.E. Thrasher, who was the auditor at that time, said, well, I might have a little piece for you today. We pricked up our ears. He said, we've just completed the state property tax digest. This was 1950, I believe. He said, for the first time, we're back up to the property tax value that we were in 1860. Now that tells you what happened across that span of 90 years. Damn little economics. So our depression really just extended right on to World War II. And then things began to pick up and pick up quite rapidly. But anyway, you asked me about,
What was the population of Atlanta in 1950? Do you remember?
I've written it down half a dozen times, but
It was 10,000 in 1865, and it was 390,000, I think, in 1940.
and you're asking about 1950?
About 1950, had it grown any during that 10-year period of time?
I don't know, but I know where to find it. It's in the almanac, because they list the standard metropolitan area populations back to 1790.
Excuse me for interrupting you.
Oh, anyway, as you noted, grew up in Atlanta, went to boys' high school, thanks to Washington Lee University. Knowing really from junior high that I wanted to be in journalism. And all came because of the course I took at Joe Brown Junior High School. And so I was able to pursue the classical liberal arts studies at Boys High and got into Washington Lee University in Virginia and followed the journalism school there. Came out 1939 and went to work on the old Atlanta Georgian, which was the Hearst paper here. And I had done an internship with them in the summer of 1938-39. And so I went in to see the managing editor when I graduated from college. And he said, well, you did a pretty decent job when you were here last summer. And we'd like to have you, but we just don't have a place. And some friends of mine were going west on the Southland camps. So I went along with them as a driver. And came back, I think, on a Thursday in August, late August. Went to see the managing editor of the Journal on Friday. He said, same song, second verse, we still don't have a place. One of the reporters died on Saturday, and I went to work on Tuesday. And so that convinced me that luck plays a big role in our lives. And I worked on the Georgian until it was acquired by the Cox interest in December of 1939. And merged with the Journal. But that meant the town had an awful lot of newspaper reporters, so I had to look around somewhere else. And I went to Charleston, South Carolina, then to Washington, D.C. on Washington Times Herald. I met my wife there, or the girl who became my wife, after 2 or 3 weeks in town. We were married in November of 1940. In 1941, we vacationed in Miami Beach. And by that time, some of the old Georgian crowd had assembled there. And so I stopped by to see them, and Hoke Welch, who had been my, excuse me, let me back up. I went by to see him, and the city editor said, why don't you come to work with us down here? So I thought about it. After I got back to, we got back to Washington, we called again, and he said, yeah, just get here in time for the first hurricane. And so we did. By about 3 days, and that was my introduction to journalism in Miami. And I was in Miami, writing primarily feature stories, at the time of Pearl Harbor. And I remember, as everyone else does, exactly when and how I got word of it. I was taking the Sunday afternoon nap, and our neighbor and my wife were talking across the fence, and she'd alerted us to it. And So then I felt from the very beginning that this is going to be pretty disruptive, but you got to get into it some way. So I applied for a job with the FBI, and I knew they were taking some newspapermen at that time, but they weren't interested in me. However, naval intelligence was, and so I guess it was November that I first became a part of the Navy as a civilian investigative agent in Miami. And then my commission came through in December, early December of '39. Not 39, but
40,
42.
42.
41. Yes, 42.
42.
And in 43 was given over pretty much to the usual schools, indoctrination, and 2 intelligence schools, and finally an assignment to Santa Barbara, California, the Marine Corps Air Station. Although I was in the Navy, there were just 2 naval officers on the air station, the doctor and myself. And dealing in operational intelligence. Usually just trying to figure out why the Marines were cracking up so many airplanes. But that very pleasant 6 months ended in January of 1944. In fact, 1944 was probably my most interesting year so far as war stories are concerned. Because early in that year, B-24 had stopped overnight in Santa Barbara at Santa Marine Corps Air Station there. And I had met the fellows when they came in. They were ferrying something to Maxton, North Carolina. And they asked me if I would like to ride to Maxton with them. It'd be easy to get a lift there to Atlanta, and I could see my family. And I was thinking about that. My wife and I talked about it, and we decided that, well, if we just had a little more money, I probably could do it. But we didn't have a little more money because I hadn't been promoted in December. And so I called them up to the hotel and said, thanks, but no thanks. And the next day they cracked up that B-24 taking off from San Francisco. And so I was just as glad I had not made JG in December. But it wasn't long before I did get my orders to join Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 16, wherever they may be. Well, being a smart intelligence officer, I just checked the information I had, and it looked like all the PT boat squadrons were in the South or Southwest Pacific. So I loaded up a lot of summertime gear, had it sent on up to San Francisco to a friend, and flew home with my wife, and then back to San Francisco. And walked in, rugged-faced chief there said, what can I do for you? Said, I'm Ensign Goodwin, and I'm looking for Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 16, wherever they may be. This is around the 1st of January. He flips the card file and he says, Attu, Alaska. And here I'm coming from a balmy part of California to the last stop on the Aleutian chain of islands before you get to the nowhere. And it took about a month to get out there. But I had a second near miss on the way. There was no problem to take a train up to Seattle. And then I was in the BOQ there for a while because there was bad weather out the chain, and I was supposed to go to Kodiak. And finally, when they had a system whereby those of us at the BOQ waiting transportation would go by and look in Pan American's window, because Pan American had some charters to the Navy. And if your name was there, then you would go to the airport early the next morning. So I developed a nice friendship with a warrant officer. We went there a couple of times, and our names weren't there, so we went on and had a pleasant dinner. And this night they were there. We still went on and had a pleasant dinner. The next morning, hired ourselves out to the Seattle airport. And we were put on a Pan American passenger plane, heading for Kodiak. But before we could take off, the pilot came back and said, we need to take, I forget whether it was 2 or 4 of us, out of the back seats and put you on another plane. And so we said, okay, so we did. Saw the one we were supposed to be on take off, and we went over to a cargo clunk of DC-3. They were both DC-3. And before long it took off and headed for Kodiak. But we'd no sooner gotten airborne than you could look out and see the ice forming on the wings. And the pilot called back to us on the intercom and said, I got to put this thing down. And so we sort of gulped and waited for what comes next. What came next was he broke through the overcast at Comox, Canada. And we landed on a brand new Canadian Air Force base there. May have been the first plane landing there. And spent the night there, and the Canadians were very nice to us. The next morning we took off for Kodiak. Clear, bright weather. A strong wind. In fact, at one point I think our ground speed across the Gulf of Alaska was something like 50 knots. But we made it on into Kodiak. And that's where we learned that the plane we had been taken off of had crashed at Yakataga. Again, with the loss of everybody aboard. And so that's what I meant by near miss number 2. And then from Kodiak, went to Adak, had to spend a couple of weeks there because of storms and all further up the chain. But eventually on to Attu, I think it was 2 weeks in Adak, a day to get on out to Attu. And got there on March 15 of 1944. Well, whoever thought that you could operate PTs in the Aleutians was near insane. And finally the Navy figured that out, and so they ordered back for refitting both the squadron on Adak and our squadron on Attu. These were Higgins boats with great big rudders on them. And another fellow and I flew back, and that was in May of 44. And he went to his home and I went to mine. My wife and I went up into the mountains of North Carolina for a few days. And it was there, we were there on June 6th, D-Day in Europe. And I got a telegram or some message from the Navy to hire myself back to the squadron. And so I did. We got in to Atlanta that night, and I went on to San Francisco the next day. And the squadron was being refitted had 40 millimeter guns put on the stern, a 40 millimeter gun put on the stern of each boat. And the boats went to New Guinea by tankers, or most of tankers, but sometimes freighters. And I went out with a base force on a freighter. And we got to New Guinea, and I left them at Milne Bay and went on up to Finchhaven, and thence to a place called Windy Island, which is where the PTs were based there, and rejoined Squadron 16. And they didn't have much activity on Windy. Some patrolling on the New Guinea coast, but not much. War had pretty much gone past, although they did liberate a group of prisoners from one of the islands down there. And then big show was Endora. Again, turning back in your mind to 1944. After the Second Battle of the Philippines, a very long battle that strung out over a couple of weeks, which was the Japanese effort to toss our troops out of Leyte in the Philippines, which was their first landing, our troops' first landing. We were trying to build an airfield, and somebody finally realized it was a rainy season in Leyte, but the dry season in the western Philippines. So came the idea of go out there and take an airfield and be able to operate aircraft. And so they elected our 2 squadrons and a couple of boats from Squadron 17 to be the Navy at Endora. And we went into Endora on December 15 of 1944. And we were only 90 miles from Clark Field, where the Japanese had a major air base. And we saw that for them, the only game in town, so they beat on us pretty vigorously for the next couple of 3 weeks. And at the end of 1944, there was a Japanese task force that showed up. And we had some warning that they were coming. As I recall, it was a light cruiser and 8 or 9 destroyers. And they shelled us for about 45 minutes, but nothing hit into our area. A couple of days later, one of the enlisted men was back behind where our base was. And he came back and he said that area was completely pockmarked with shell holes. They were over just a few hundred yards, which again was a very pleasant development. But that night, there was our own air forces from Leyte were able to attack that task force, and they damaged a destroyer. And we had 2 boats north of us, and they were coming south, and the Japanese were going north, and they spotted them and moved out and sank the damaged destroyer. And the interesting thing about that was a couple of days later, we rescued 2 Japanese survivors of that destroyer. And they were the ones who gave the Navy the information that Japanese most significant battleship, the Musashi, I believe she was, which was thought to have been sunk, actually was sunk. They had been in the crew of Musashi. And so that left the Japanese with only 1 modern battleship, Yamato. And so that told the Navy a good bit, and I guess that's what operations intelligence officers are supposed to do, get information in one direction and pass it in the other. And that's pretty much what I did through my naval career, both at Endora and wherever else I happened to be. I remember at Endora, we had a Navy circular. Somehow, they had interviewed a fellow who was supposed to have been a kamikaze pilot, but bailed out or something. But anyway, they had a pretty good interview with him. And he said that their doctrine was that American ships in a crisis tended to turn left. And I thought about it, and that wasn't true of our PT squad. So we put that in the briefing, and just before we got to Endora. So the tactic became to feint left and turn right. And we actually only lost 1 PT boat in action at Endora. At the same time, the boat shot down, or the planes crashed themselves, 25 or 26 of them.
Japanese planes?
Japanese planes.
These were shot down by the PT boats?
Either they shot down by the PT boats, or they crashed, or sought to crash them and missed them. And Endora was quite a show. For those of us who weren't on the boats, including the Army guys and the Seabees who were going to build the airfield, and the Army anti-aircraft batteries that were going to protect the airfield, went up in LSTs. And we were 3 abreast going into the beach. And the Japanese successfully attacked with kamikazes, the one on either side of us. Just barely missed us. I've got a picture of a kamikaze crashing about 20 feet off the side of our LST. So that meant we weren't able to build as complete a PT base as the Navy had said they wanted us back on December 15. But nevertheless, the boats began operating the night of December 15. In fact, 2 of them shot down a Japanese aircraft on the morning of the 15th. And then, as I said, the next 2 weeks were pretty harried. It was during that time that they made a successful attack on a PT tender that had come up to Endora, USS Orestes. And while she wasn't sunk, she was so badly damaged that she had no further value in the war and had a severe loss of life. And then a few nights thereafter, the washing machine Charlie, who came to bomb every night, dropped one right squarely in their camp and killed some more of them. But that was war. And so after Mindoro, I was called back to PT headquarters in the 7th Fleet and assigned to another squadron down around Mindanao. And we operated there for several weeks, and then their regular man came back from leave or wherever he was. And I finally got passage home on a carrier in October of 45, and came back to Atlanta, and then to Miami. I went into the Daily News in Miami. The managing editor was a good friend, and he said, "Hi, we've been waiting for you, and your typewriter's waiting for you too. And you got a 10% raise." And I said, "Is that by any chance the same raise the elevator operator got?" He said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, thanks, but I think I'll try Atlanta first." So I came back to Atlanta, and that's how I made my connection with the Atlanta Journal. Because the fellow who had been managing editor of the Georgian a number of years before, when I had interned there and worked until it was closed, was then managing editor of the Journal. And so that was the beginning of 7 years of my newspaper career on the Journal. That was followed by 2 years as head of what's now Central Atlanta Progress, and 10 years as vice president in charge of advertising and public relations and community relations for the First National Bank of Atlanta. And in that process, I got involved with the Forward Atlanta program in the 1960s. And my assignment was to head up the advertising and PR activities. Well, we had a good ad agency in Tuckaway, but we needed a larger PR firm than any of, well, really there was only one in Atlanta at that time. 2 ad agencies said they had a PR department. And so, what did happen on that thing? Oh yes, and so on the 1st of January of 1965, I opened the Atlanta office of Manning, Selvage and Lee. Then it was a little firm called Bell and Stanton, and they were the PR firm that we had finally located for the Forward Atlanta program. And that was 4 years ago, and our firm this year will celebrate its 40th anniversary.
Congratulations.
That brings me up to date.
Do you remember what you felt like going over to the Pacific? Were you scared? Were you scared at any time? Don't mean to say you weren't scared, or were you too young to do anything except do what you needed to do?
Well, I guess it was a mixture of things. You grow up in this country and you sort of know that if it becomes necessary, you're going to get involved in a war, or really should if you're physically able to. And so after Pearl Harbor, that was pretty much, to me, a foregone conclusion. It was just a question of where and how. And I was, again, just awfully fortunate that the Navy, the Naval Intelligence, was looking for lawyers and newspapermen. And when you think about my career, which I kind of outlined to you, you realize that for different masters, I did the same thing pretty much all the way through. Information comes in, you do something with it, information goes out. And that's sort of the whole field of operational intelligence. And except on that night the Japanese were shelling us, I didn't have any real sense of fear. There was more a sense of obligation and altness, and things got interesting and you did whatever needed to be done wherever you happened to be. And everybody, I guess, was conceited enough to realize that it wouldn't be them. Some of them were mistaken.
I mean, the PT boats around Endora had one of the most celebrated battle citations you could get, as I
Yes,
recall.
they had a Navy unit commendation. I wrote that citation, actually. I wrote it as, at the suggestion of the squadron commander for presidential unit citation. And they downgraded it one to the Navy unit thing, but they had a hard time. I think that how many was it? I guess we had 24 boats there. And combined, they shot down more enemy aircraft than all the other PTs in the war. And of course, the Japanese were not too bright about it because all they had to do was hit the fuel barge and they'd put us out of business, or destroy the docks. But they were electing to dive at individual boats. The boats took care of themselves, with one exception. One of them was lost. But
Did you do the interrogation of the Japanese prisoners that you caught?
I was in on it. We had somebody who spoke Japanese who did it. I did. The two after the sinking of the Kawashima, the destroyer. Well, yes, they were brought into our base, and we had somebody come over from Lady who spoke Japanese. They did the interview.
What was the feeling toward the Japanese prisoners when you would encounter them? Was it just informational or doing your job?
Yeah, information. They're human beings too. Although there was one prisoner at the time brought in by the boat somehow, I've forgotten now. And he was dispatched to a prison collection base somewhere. And I think he was shot. It shouldn't have been, but I have an idea it was. The Japanese are pretty tough fighters, but once they realized they were in custody, they talked fairly freely.
How'd you feel on VJ Day?
Mixed emotions. I was damn happy to have it come and wondering how soon I could get a ride back home. And it was a while, several weeks, but I finally got back on one of the Jeep carriers.
You and Skippy had no children at that time, or did you have children?
No, we did not have children at that time. She worked at her parents' home at the Naval Proving Ground at Delvin, Virginia. Her father was a leading civilian there. And very interesting place. Today they have at the entrance to that proving ground a chunk of naval armor with a shell halfway through it, because that's where they seek to develop the armor that can't be pierced and the shell that can pierce any armor. And so she had grown up with the Navy in her mind and her heart.
What'd you feel like when you returned to the United States in October?
Awfully glad to be here. And I will never forget that somebody in San Diego had put a small marker. I say small, it looks small, but you read it, on the channel coming into the port of San Diego. Welcome home. And that was about the two nicest words I ever saw.
How long did it take you to get from San Diego back to Atlanta?
Not long, no. Less than a week. I flew to Delvin, or to Washington. Skippy met me there. And then we came on down by train.
Were you able to find a place to live when you returned to Atlanta?
Yes, we were very fortunate. We found an apartment in a converted house on Lawton Street. And moved in, I guess, in December of '45. And I went to work on the Journal the 1st of January of '46. We were living in that house at the time of the Winecoff Telfair. I was one of those who covered that. I had a very happy newspaper career. Writing urban affairs and feature stories, covering City Hall. Things at City Hall usually happen in the morning, and so you had your afternoons to do other stories. It was really much fun. Somebody once said, speaking of the newspaper business, where else can you have so much fun on so little money? There's some truth in that. Although it's been materially corrected since I was
You've spent your life in the private sector but doing public good for a lot of people around this town. There's obviously a sense of public service in your heart. I'm just wondering how you feel the war molded those feelings, if you already had them growing up ahead of time, and how you feel today after the Vietnam era and what's going on in the world today.
Well, I began to sense the feelings of pride in Atlanta. From the time I was a very small boy, I sold magazines downtown. And of course the city wasn't terribly large then in the 20s and 30s. I've never felt quite the affection to the state of Georgia as I did for the city of Atlanta. The United States, I had the same high level of admiration and affection for. But those were years when politics in Georgia were pretty messy. So I've always been very proud of Atlanta. I've been involved in a lot of fronts in it as a volunteer in the main. Awfully glad I had that. The Forward Atlanta program was an exceedingly useful thing. It really lifted Atlanta out of the group of old Southern baseball league cities, Birmingham, Memphis, Nashville, Chattanooga, and so forth, New Orleans. This was the city that went up, was the first of the big leagues. Still a shining star. I'm very proud of it.
You've played a major role in it.
I got involved in some things. One of the things was the Woodruff Arts Center, what's now the Woodruff Arts Center. Somehow I had wound up as president or chairman of Theater Atlanta, and we didn't have any place to perform. The symphony was playing down in the Old City Auditorium, and the museum and the art school were all crowded into Mrs. Hyde's house, into a little building they had built on Peachtree Street in front of there. And so the time was just right for trying to put together some physical situation that would handle theater and symphony and the art school. And that became the Woodruff Arts Center. Philip Weltner, the senior who had been president of Oglethorpe, was very active in pushing for that. And, so often in my life, it seems like I got there just about the time things were going to happen anyway, whether I'd been there or not. But anyway, I'm glad I was there.
What lessons would you like to leave somebody my age or my children? My children in their 30s now. My grandchildren are school-age children getting ready to enter junior high school.
Well, if I could leave just one thought, it would be this. Time is the irreplaceable element. Use time when you have it or can get it to do the things you want to do. We did a great deal of traveling, for example, up until fairly recently. And just looking back, I've known so many people who died or had other unfortunate things happen to them before they got around to doing the things they wanted to do. And my wife and I look at each other and think, well, we did damn near all the things we wanted to do. And we went all the places we wanted to go. I wouldn't mind seeing the Hindu Kush in northern India. Other than that, we've given up cruises. Our son drives us. But it's been a good life, full life.
What anniversary are you celebrating this year?
64.
That's a pretty good record.
And we're both in pretty decent health, so I hope we'll make it in November.
Do you mind telling us, we've got a few more minutes, about the Telfair County incident?
Well, that incident grew out of the election of 1946, in which Herman Talmadge, the son of Eugene Talmadge, ran for governor against Jimmy Carmichael. And it was a close campaign. I think Carmichael won the popular vote, but Herman won the county unit vote. So since the system was since the voting was under the county unit system, it was Herman who was elected. And we had some some suggestions that there was something amiss with that election. Nobody was quite sure what it was. We went snooping around, and the challenge was to voting patterns or voting procedures in Dodge and Telfair counties. So the managing editor sent me down to those two counties, a couple of contacts in Dodge. I met, had a photographer with me. It turned out,
We've got this one on.
it turned out that there was no story in Dodge County, the county seat of which is Eastman. But it looked like there had been something amiss in Telfair, where McRae is the county seat. There had been an issue of the Telfair Enterprise, I believe was the name of the paper, soon after the election in, after the election in the fall, and noted that Herman had some write-in votes. I forget the number now, maybe 48 or something like that, 53. And they just sort of laughed at it at the time. Somebody was remembering his father and writing in. But nevertheless, they would not have been write-in votes. It was simply that when the results of that election got into the legislature, like we had the disruptions of 4 years ago in the national election, Telfair County was showing up with considerably more votes than had been reported back at the time of the election. And so one of the Secretary of State's assistants and I went looking for the actual ballots from Telfair County. And we found them down in the basement of the state capitol. And we were looking at them and suddenly realized that the last 30 some odd votes were written in the same handwriting and in alphabetical order. And Herman Talmadge later said, I told so-and-so to get me some votes, but I didn't tell him to get them that way. But nevertheless, that was the basis of the Telfair County vote fraud story. And it was a thin year for Pulitzer Prizes. So it won for the prize in 48 for reporting. Actually, it was based on stories in 1947. But again, that's the fun of being in urban affairs. Something is always happening there.
Well, George, this has been a pleasure for me.
Well, it's been a pleasure to be with you.
Is it?
I feel I've dominated the conversation, but if you have any more questions,
I just
share them
listening,
with me.
listening to you talk is a real treat. Is there anything else you'd like to tell us?
Only that don't ever bet against Atlanta. This place is going to be the nation's shining star. I have every confidence that it will be one of the major cities of the world one day.
Well, I think it would have even a better chance if we could clone you over and over again and put you in every borough and district around the
You'd be
city.
surprised how many people who feel the same way I do are around town. And they're of all ages. And this place keeps progressing, keeps growing. I have done some writing on Atlanta, but I remember that something that was never published, but started out with the line from Paul, I am a citizen of no mean city, and you can interpret mean any way you want.
That's great. Well, it's been through your leadership and others like you, you had a vision, ambition, ability, and optimism that we've gotten to where we are.
Well, you're very kind.
And I can't tell you what an honor it is for me to sit down in the room with you for an hour
Well, it's been much fun.
and let us put
I've
this
enjoyed
in
every
the
second of it.
archives of the Atlanta History Center and the Library of Congress.
All right.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
I think I know how to turn this off.